Kimball's revelation was broadly well received, but was still a bit of a shock. People wanted to know what conditions changed to allow such a revelation to come. After 1978, the next phase of scholarship continued to examine the history of the racial restrictions, with more research building off of Lester Bush. The summer 1979 issue of Dialogue was devoted to race and the new revelation on the one-year anniversary. Newell Bringhurst published an important article in that issue, Elijah Abel and the Changing Status of Blacks Within Mormonism. Bringhurst is one of the most important scholars on race in Mormonism, also having published on this topic again and again. This paper really dives into the history of Elijah Abel, one of the early black converts who was ordained to the Melchizedek priesthood and the rank of 70 in 1836. Bush and others had mentioned Abel, and his story became crucial to retelling Mormonism's racial past by hearkening to a more egalitarian version of Mormonism founded by Joseph Smith himself. The article also chronicles Abel's status in the Utah period, and racial segregation and racism became increasingly important in Mormonism, and how Abel got caught up in that fight and navigated it. In that same 1979 issue, Dialogue has tons of commentary on the revelation from luminaries like Sterling McMurrin, Jerry Bradford, George Smith, and others. But the Dialogue editors also included the collected testimonies of ex-slave Samuel D. Chambers. Lester Bush was an associate editor at Dialogue and was surely behind this, introducing the primary sources of Chambers' testimony from the Salt Lake Deacons Quorum Minute Book, 1873 to 77, 1 century before the 1978 revelation. They are remarkable to read over for how a black man in the 1870s in Utah participated in the church community. A few years later, in 1981, Armand Moss returns to the topic with The Fading of the Pharaoh's Curse, the Decline and Fall of the Priesthood Ban Against Blacks in the Mormon Church. This article really focuses on telling the history of the public controversy in the 1950s to the 1970s. It lays out an early account of the role that David O. McKay played in the eventual change of church teachings by attributing to him the new distinction between policy and doctrine, the priesthood ban being a policy and not a doctrine, but a policy that could only be changed by revelation. It was an attempt at a middle road between those advocating for change and those resisting it that reaffirmed revelation as the ultimate guide. The article also talks about how racialization was changing in these decades as the church was expanding internationally in the Pacific, Latin America, and in South Africa. Moss also gives an overview of what he calls the Stormy 60s, as the church dealt with unrest about the practice in and out of the church. It was a decade of bad publicity. At the same time, the doctrinal basis for the policy was further eroding. In the 1970s, the church was making more overtures to the black community to build bridges, especially after the series of civil rights protests in the decade before, including those against BYU. They are also beginning to offer more support to black members of the church, especially in lending support to the Genesis Group, founded in 1971, that offered opportunities for black members to socialize and support one another. The church also faced less intensive public pressure in and out of the church, and the hypothesis developed that this respite gave the church some breathing room to make changes that didn't look like capitulation to pressure. Moss had put forward this theory about how pressure against the church causes retrenchment before the revelation, but he seemed vindicated in his argument here. At the same time, he chronicles a number of public episodes from 1972 to 1978 showing that the issue hadn't really gone away publicly. It led to conflicts and embarrassing episodes in the media with the Boy Scouts and several excommunications of members who did ordain black men while it was forbidden. But the guiding factor, according to Moss, was the proselytization in Brazil, especially the decision to build a temple there. Brazil was so racially mixed that determining lineage was nearly impossible and ultimately unwise. There's more to the story, but Moss analyzes closely the proximate causes for the revelation and gives a detailed history of what was known up until that point.
This is Taylor Petrie, editor of Dialogue. I want to tell you about the Dialogue Podcast Network. In addition to great audio content you'll find in our feed, this collection is made up of shows by Latter-day Saints who wish to bring their faith into dialogue with larger streams of religious thought, like Mormon News Report, which takes a deep dive into topics pertaining to LDS culture, or Beyond the Block, which centers the marginalized in Mormonism. Other podcasts in this network include Vase in Hat, Words Fall In, and Gospel Tangents podcast. For links to these and all the other amazing content Dialogue has to offer, visit dialoguejournal.com. And while you're there, consider donating. Your sustained generosity is what enables us to continue our mission of facilitating dialogue in a spirit of learning and understanding. Thank you.